All right, so good afternoon. Welcome to the official start of Arlington County's fiscal year 2020 budget season. Today is the momentous occasion in which the county manager gets to hand off the FY 2020 budget, as is our custom, in accord with direction that this board provided last fall. And we eagerly anticipate in hearing what the county manager presents for us, which will be the subject of 2 months of the board working through the budget through a series of work sessions and ultimately culminating with an April 23rd adoption of the budget. So with that as preamble, I will turn it over to Mr. Schwartz and just note for the record that all 5 board members are in attendance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first off, before I go through any of the details, I wanted to extend my thanks to staff, especially in the Department of Management and Finance, a lot of who were here yesterday, working very hard on the final details, and for all the departmental staff that have worked very hard since September on coming up with this proposal. So let me start off at a place where I didn't actually expect I would be, which is that this budget has in it some challenges, but it also offers you a number of choices. Unlike where I thought I was going to be last September, we have, fortunately, come across the finish line on the proposal with an improved outlook. And we'll go on the first slide to focus a little bit on the overview. What has changed since the fall of 2018? Well, we have some increased revenue estimates. I'll talk about that in a minute. We also have the guidance that you provided me back in November in 2018, and I've been able to follow through on the priorities that you had assigned to increasing compensation for employees, investing in housing and infrastructure, and also at the same time paying attention to schools, Medicaid expansion, and Metro. My budget proposes a tax rate increase of 1.5 cents. I'll get into a little bit more details later about how that's split between county and schools. We also have reductions in the budget, and those reductions that I'm proposing are reductions for programs that I think, though they certainly have served a useful purpose in the past, I think there are different ways of delivering those kinds of services, and they can be done differently. The reductions involved do affect about 20 employees who are currently working in the county, and there are additional 10 positions that are currently vacant that I'm proposing for elimination. And also, there is, in my proposed budget, additional resources set aside for what we anticipate to be an increase in the development pipeline over the next year or year and a half. So let's go to the next slide. And so, back in the fall of 2018, when we made our initial presentation, the county estimate between revenues and expenses at that time was a range between $20 and $35 million as a gap between revenues and expenses. And schools had an estimate somewhere over $40 million. So one of the main underpinnings of that was an assumption that real estate assessments would grow by 2% over calendar 18 through calendar year 18. Now, in January, when people received their assessments, and the information that we provided then, the assessments, rather than going up 2%, went overall up by 3.5%, which was characterized by 2 pieces. One was the commercial assessments went up 4.1%, and residential assessments up 2.9%. Now that was a surprise. It was a surprise to me, and it was a surprise to many of us, because the commercial assessments did better than residential assessments, which I think is a sign for optimism, given that our vacancy rate, which had been at one point close to 21% back in 2015, is now trending lower at 17.4%, or 17.6, I think. Okay. So we have also, as I would say it, a confluence of important and surprising events that also lowered our expenses. The healthcare cost estimate for county employees overall is going up very slightly, almost very close to 0%, which is, in my experience, a big surprise. Usually we're looking sometimes at double digits or high single digit increases. We also realized some savings in our estimates for other post-employment benefit, retiree health care costs. We also realized some increases in interest income and lease revenue related to the property that we own here, but we ground lease to various entities. So those were some surprises, all to the good. Let's go to the next slide. So let's just focus on the numbers for a second. The total budget that I'm proposing is $1.34 billion. And you can see the two main components of that are the county operating funds at $810 million and the school transfer of a little bit over $525 million. Now, one thing that's not shown on this slide that I did want to focus on, with my proposed 1.5-cent tax increase, this is an important sort of fact to get your head wrapped around, of the additional revenue coming in, which comes close to about $40 million in revenue, 20.6 million of that's going to go to the public schools, and a little bit over 18 will come to the county. Now, that's not on that slide, but it's in, we have some other detailed information that we'll be providing and some other handouts to you. So if you take a look there also, you will see that the overall increase is, the number I really like to focus on is the ongoing funding increase. It's 3.6% overall, and you can see for county operating, that's a 2.8% increase in ongoing, but for schools, it's a 4.1% increase in ongoing. Now, the other information we've added in there, if you remember that the board decided at closeout of last year to roll over all the one-time funds, and we have a significant amount of one-time money available, which when you add in, gives you the other sets of percentages. But when you're doing budgeting, I think it's really important to focus on what your ongoing resources are. The one-time funds, we're in a happy circumstance this year where we have a fair amount of them, but that's something that varies year over year. Now let's go to the next slide. So in the budget, we did a few things. The first thing we're doing, and we'll talk about, is doing some spending reductions. Also, we have the opportunity for investments, and those investments align with what the county board provided in guidance. Talked a little bit about the tax increase, and then, as directed by the board, in lieu of the tax increase, you suggested I come up with some suggestions that you could look at if you chose not to raise taxes, and I also do that. I also come up with a list of items that I do not recommend, but are available for you to consider if you choose not to increase the tax rate as I recommend. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail on the proposed spending reductions. Now, the proposed spending reductions come to a little bit over $5 million. And so, as I said previously, the kinds of cuts that we're talking about this year, or the reprioritizing of resources, are places where service demands have declined. And also, we found another way to do business. I was very concerned at this table back in April and also in September that my budget would have to propose service reductions to programs that work really well, given the gap. That is not the case. The reductions I'm proposing, though there certainly are very important things that we've been doing, I think that doing without them do not fundamentally alter the way we provide services. Now, those people who are affected by that obviously will feel differently, and some of the programs that I've focused on, we can have a longer conversation. But by way of example, you know, we're continuing this year with a proposal to reduce some resources we have for our employment center down at the Department of Human Services. Now, that is because the way work is looked at, the way people seek jobs has changed markedly in the last 5 to 10 years, and we have a different kind of service model. We'll be able to provide service to our residents is the way we think makes sense, and we're moving away from a different model. Doesn't mean that the services we provided over the last 5 years have been worthless. They've been very important, but there's a different way to do that. And you'll see in some of the other proposed reductions, those kinds of changes. So notice, as you notice here, and I think I've mentioned previously, the number of positions impacted were close to 30, and 18.5 of them are filled. We also have some additional cost-saving measures which don't affect staff. I'll give you an example. We, every year, take a look at our art bus services, And if there are art bus services that aren't performing according to the criteria we've talked about, we will propose reductions in that, and there is a route that we're proposing in this case. We're also, the Treasurer's Office I'll just give another example. They're realizing some savings of about $80,000 because we're no longer going to be using the tax decal. There is a number of examples like that. And also we have proposed a change in the way we provide cell phone service to county employees, and we'll be saving some costs on that kind of contract. So those were focused a little bit on reductions. Let's talk about the priorities that the county board laid out in the guidance and what I've done to try to meet them. So first, and this is where I always like to start because this is the most important asset we have as a community, is our county workforce. We have in my proposed budget, I'm continuing my commitment and following the board's adoption of the pay philosophy last summer to address the pay issues facing our public safety and general employees. So last year, I'm sure you recall, we provided increases for public safety that were a similar amount that we're proposing this year, somewhere between 5 and 7%. And this year, I'm coming back and proposing on average a 5.5% increase for public safety. Now, depending on where you are in your career, individuals who are coming on to the fire department and the police department, they'll be actually getting a lot more of an increase than their compatriots would have from a year or two ago. People who have been here longer tenured may not be getting as much of an increase, but everyone will be getting an increase. And in addition, I'm proposing that we raise the ceiling so that people who have been, quote, maxed out on their employee compensation, that ceiling will be going up at least 2%. I'm happy to report, at least to date, that our ability to recruit firefighters and police officers has improved. I think several of you have had the opportunity to attend fire graduations and police officer swearing in. We have done, I think, a really good job, and we've gone a long way to address some, but certainly not all the issues that we talked about last year. But we need to continue that effort. For general employees, I'm proposing a pay increase of somewhere in the range between 3.25% and 3.5%, depending on whether they're in pay for performance. And again, all these increases are merit-based, so people need to perform their job effectively in order to receive them. And also, consistent with the commitments that I made last year, we're also taking a look at a series of job classifications to see which ones are further behind and which ones may require some additional adjustment. Now, we're in a full employment economy. And the biggest challenge I feel like I face as a manager, my department heads face, is recruitment and retention. Now, I think I can say fairly confidently, when people come to work here, they like it a lot. And it takes a lot for them to leave. But getting people to come here and work has proven to be a challenge. And I think that challenge will grow as time goes on. So I think this is an important set of priorities. I mentioned a little bit about where we were on health care, that we had the good fortune of realizing very low cost increases. There's a difference between Cigna, the Cigna plans for employees and Kaiser. Kaiser premiums will be going up a little bit. Cigna, they will not be going up. I talked a little bit about the studies we're doing about job classifications that are a little bit further behind. We gloss over this, but I think that we are the envy of almost any other municipal government in the United States. We are fully funding our pension and retiree health care costs. Our pension system is funded we're still over 100% of, 101? Yeah, okay. And for our retiree health care, we're one of the few jurisdictions that has actually tackled the other post-employment benefit issue. We're not to a point where we're exactly fully funded, but we're well on our way, ahead of most every other jurisdiction in the Commonwealth in the country. And then one other thing I did want to mention, which was last year, you can recall, in the adoption of the budget, in order to fund the public safety pay increases beyond what I had proposed in the budget, remember last year we said that if you wanted to add something, you needed to take something away? So last year, in order to fund some of the public safety increases, there was a decision made to defund 10 positions in the police department and 6 in the sheriff's office. Given where we are right now, I'm proposing that the funding be added back for those 10 positions in the police department and 6 positions in the sheriff's office. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide, a little bit more about where we are with the public schools. So, as you can see from the bullet points here, and as I mentioned previously, the increase in the transfer to the schools is approximately $25 million, close to, that's including ongoing and one-time, close to a 5% increase. And of the 1.5 cent tax increase I'm proposing 1 cent of that, 2/3 of the tax increase, go to schools. If the board were to adopt that, given a little bit of the arcana about the way the revenue sharing is done, we would start the fiscal 21 budget with a different revenue sharing percentage than we do now. It would actually increase the percentage for the schools on a going forward basis. Now, the 1/2 cent that I'm proposing on the county side, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but one of the biggest components of that tax increase is to pay for staff in the schools. So, and remind the community, we have somewhere at least about $8 million right now of funding in the county budget that goes for items such as school resource officers, school nurses, crossing guards, and my proposed budget and the part of the tax increase on the county side is to add about 5.5 staff to the county workforce that would provide additional school resource officers and nurses for Arlington Public Schools and their use. Also, and this was a big issue last year, we are proposing for the first time in, I think since we've adopted the Memorandum of Understanding with Public Schools, which was at least 2010, we're proposing an increase in the amount of transfer to schools for the aquatics program. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the fee proposals, but one of the ones also would potentially add additional revenue to schools related to the aquatics program. So, let's go on. Next big priority, and something that I've spent a lot of time, and I think the board has spent a lot of time, we've had a lot of conversations about housing affordability. Not only has this become much more of a focused conversation given the announcement in November by Amazon that they were interested in coming to Arlington, it's been a question that we've wrestled with for many years. So one of the things that I'm proposing in the budget, this is for the housing grant program. In the last 9 years, we have continued to provide housing grants to needy residents of Arlington, and we've continued to, the program has grown. The one thing that has never changed over the last decade is the amount of money that each individual recipient can get has essentially lost its purchasing power. As rents have gone up, the amounts that they can get have been capped. So essentially, a lot of the people who were supposed to benefit from this program have been forced into the situation of spending much higher percentages of their own personal income in order to stay in committed affordable units. So that cap on that program has been something that's limited the amount of money that can go to each of the individuals. I'm proposing additional resources, a little bit more than $500,000. Actually, I think it's about $800,000 total for the program to lift that cap and so make it so that everybody who's participating in that program will pay a lower percentage towards their full rental costs. And also, consistent with the direction from the board, I'm thrilled this year to say, because we went for many years by funding our housing grant program with a mix of ongoing and one-time money, I'm able to fund all of it. All of the funds for the housing grant program are ongoing funds, which is, I'm very happy to be able to say that. So we have, that's a little bit about the housing grant program. The Affordable Housing Investment Fund. It's very important to note that I'm talking about here an investment in additional general fund dollars, and we'll have a longer conversation. The Affordable Housing Investment Fund has considerably more resources than that. It gets repayments from loans and developer contributions, but I'm proposing $14.5 million, which is a slight increase above last year. That increase does not come from a county general fund, but it comes from federal home funds, which have increased by a few $100,000. I've also been able to make some progress on increasing the amount of ongoing funds. We had a 50-50 split last year. This year, 60% of my proposed funding is ongoing. And there's a last bullet there that talks about work on our digital equity initiative, which is providing funding for some of our affordable housing providers to be able to make use of our Connect Arlington network. And then there's a much longer series of pieces of information in the budget on an initiative we're calling Housing Arlington, but I know I'm going to hear a lot more from the board on that, and we will be talking about a number of steps to take over the next months to try to enhance our tools and our approach to affordable housing. So let's go on to infrastructure maintenance. So, you know, Michelle and I were talking about this before we came here. I think we don't always do this, and it's been a few years since we've done it. I've actually been able in this year's budget to propose, if you looked in the FY20 column of the CIP, remember when we adopt the CIP, we say it's a 10-year plan. The first year is the only one that counts. FY20 is year 2. But we're actually proposing exactly what we had in the CIP for FY20, which we're not able to do that in very many cases, but given the increases you can see laid out here, last year we had $5.5 million for capital maintenance. This year I'm proposing $15.5 million, which is a $10 million increase. And so that breaks into two pieces. That $15.5 million constitutes two pieces. One is $8.6 million of ongoing funding and $6.7 million of one-time funding. And so that is an effort to try, again, to get us on a firmer footing so that we can have more of our capital resources funded on an ongoing basis. Those funds include additional sums for energy efficiency for the AIR program, additional funds for the State of Good Repair, and some funds set aside, and I do not know what the total cost will be for the unfortunate situation we faced with the Westgley Bridge, which needs repair between Arlington and Alexandria, the bridge goes between, and I'm hopeful that the funding solution will be a shared funding solution between Arlington and Alexandria. A lot more details on that. So let's go on to planning and development. So we sat down with a series of, we had a number of conversations starting back in September where we tried to get an estimate of how busy the county board's going to be in 2019 and 2020. And then in November, with the announcement by Amazon that they had chosen Arlington, and if the board were to move ahead and approve the performance agreement next month, there would be an increase in some development projects related to Amazon. But it's the rest of the development world. Our staff estimate a typical year, we have 6 site plans. We're estimating over the lifetime of this budget in fiscal 20, we would have 18 site plans, so triple the amount. And there are a number of reasons. I'll let people speculate about why that's happening, but we think we're on track to do that. So given that increase in the development pipeline, we realized from that, obviously we charge fees, but the site plan fees and the development fund fees are actually much higher than we anticipated this time last year. With those additional funds, which come to well in excess of $1 million, I'm proposing that there be 4 positions added to the workforce, fully funded by either fees or incremental revenues related to that increased development, and that those positions, and you can see I've laid out the 4 positions there, a principal planner for current planning, a principal planner in the second bullet for housing, given the efforts that we need to make there, and then a zoning plan and a fire protection engineer, and essentially leaving a $1 million pot as a contingent pot for you to determine what you want to do with that. Now, that $1 million, again, is based on an assumption that a certain number of site plans are going to come in, and I can't promise you that that will be the level of activity we'll have year over year, So though the money is available for you to spend as you wish, I caution you that it may not be ongoing money. It may not be one-time money, maybe something in between, maybe a new kind of money, but it's something that you can use as you see fit, and I have not allocated it. So the one other thing I wanted to mention is that this is not related to any developer fees, but in the general fund, I've also set aside funding for a new position in Arlington Economic Development to focus on small businesses. So I know a lot of you have had the opportunity to work with Tara Palacios and BizLaunch. She is overwhelmed, and the group there just do a phenomenal job. The number of inquiries they've received, especially over the last 4 months, have gone through the roof, and there's just an incredible appetite and need for us assisting the small business community. Last bullet, which is consistent with what we did last year, we fully fund those commitments we've made based on the board adoption of previous incentive agreements with companies coming to Arlington, and we're fully funding all the required payments as part of the base budget. So let's get to the part where people, and I know there are thousands of them sitting at home saying, what does this mean for me? So with that 1.5 cent tax increase that I'm recommending, again, a half penny for the county and 1 penny for schools, that would raise here an additional close to $12 million. And you can see the split for how those funds would go to schools and to county, and some of the employee resources that would be purchased with that. The bottom bullet talks about the change, given the average assessment increase for an individual plus a 1.5 penny tax rate increase on that, that would be a $277 increase overall in fees. And we have a separate table on that, which I want to flip to, because I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. So this is a very busy table, but what I would encourage people to look at is when you get to the very bottom there, it says changes from calendar year 18 total, the very bottom line. What we do is we try to add up the cost to a, quote, typical or average Arlington homeowner. Now, I've said before, there is no such thing, but it's made up of many pieces of taxes and fees that people have to pay. The biggest one, obviously, is the real estate tax. And so you can see that with a 1.5 cent increase in the real estate tax rate, which is in that green box there, going to $6,724, that's a 4% increase by itself. But you also will see that the personal property estimate of what people will be paying is dropping from $1,024 down to $994. We have our refuse fee is dropping, and there's a small increase in the water and sewer service fee, and the residential utility tax remains constant. So with that, overall, with my proposed budget, I'm suggesting a 2.8% average increase in the tax and fee bill for the average Arlingtonian. Of course, that will vary depending on what your assessment is and what your actual costs are. All right, just a couple more slides. We're almost there. The real estate tax rate, where we always show you the peer comparison. My colleagues in Fairfax and Alexandria and Loudoun, literally within the last 7 days, each of them have come forward with proposed tax rates, and you can see them there. And the respective, the council in Alexandria and the boards and board in Fairfax will be advertising. Loudoun's already done that. We still have the lowest tax rate, even with this proposed increase. So that is, that's good. I know a lot of people rightfully focus on what their actual bill is going to be. So let's move on to the last slide before I get into sort of wrapping up about some of the tax and fee advertisements. I said to this board, and I said to the community back in the fall, that we needed to, based on the information we had heard in trying to sell bonds last year, take a close look at our reserves and financial policies. We're fortunate to have AAA ratings from each of the 3 rating agencies. And those AAA ratings, as I like to say, they may be difficult to get, but they're much more difficult to keep. And so we have been very fortunate, and each of the rating agencies have been providing us AAA ratings for many years. One of them, Moody's, has made it very clear to us, and this board is aware of that because you took action in the fall, that the level of reserves we have does not compare favorably to those of our sister or peer jurisdictions. Given that, in the fall, we proposed increasing our reserves from 5 to 5.5%. Those are the funds that we simply set aside, and they sit there, and we look at them. We can't do anything with them. So going from 5 to 5.5% was a step. I'll be back to you next month with a proposal on additional steps to increase reserves. Now, they may not all be the kinds of reserves that I was just talking about. We have additional reserves in an economic contingent fund of $4 million, and we have other pots of money, looking at a way to create a little bit more assurance for Moody's, at the same time not completely tying our hands on how that money might be able to be spent. So a lot more coming on that next month. So wrapping up on Saturday, the task before you in the form of, I think, at least 13 or 14 board reports are a series of tax and fee advertisements. The main one, obviously, is the real estate tax rate, where I'm recommending $0.015. I would point out that if you ask me after this whether I think that that's enough, I'd say that it might be. You may have some pressures related to Metro and schools that you want to take into consideration, but that's what I'm recommending for right now. We're not proposing any changes to personal property, the business, professional, occupational license taxes, or the stormwater tax rates. And we do have a large number of fee proposals, and my favorite, of course, is finally the lifetime dog license fee, which it's about time. And so with that, let me just wrap up by saying there are a few things that I wanted to mention before we get to the schedule about looking ahead. I feel we've done okay this year. We still have pressures. The pressures haven't gone away. School enrollment pressures. We'll have new facilities opening in fiscal 21, including the aquatics and fitness facility, and then the Lubber Run Community Center is opening at the end of fiscal 21. And we have, if we realize the benefits from Amazon, if the board decides to move ahead with that performance agreement and the metrics laid out by Amazon and its MOU with the state, we will not actually see the additional revenue from that until at the earliest fiscal 22. So we have another year or so to get to a place where I will feel reliably optimistic. This time last year, I was deeply pessimistic. Now I'd say that I have a sense of equanimity and with spots of optimism flashing in front of my face. So with that, let's go to the schedule, and you can see on Saturday I will do an abbreviated version of this presentation. The board then has the obligation at that time to advertise a tax rate. Again, that's the maximum you'll be able to do as you work through the process. And the rest of the dates laid out here, I think we have 11 work sessions scheduled with the county board. We have 2 public hearings, and then we actually, in July, we actually start the fiscal 20 budget, and sometime in August we start planning for the 21 budget. So with that, I covered an enormous amount of information. I hope I wasn't jumping around too much. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, but again, there'll be a lot more information available on Saturday. And so for people at home, the budget itself, the formal budget, will not be posted online until Saturday morning. And then the copies of this presentation are already online. There's over 1,000 pages worth of details in the budget, so I apologize if in the 16 slides I wasn't able to cover everything, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. And for those people who want to find those materials online that the manager referenced, that's at budget.arlingtonva.us, treasure trove of budget information for you to peruse. Colleagues, questions? Start with Ms. Crystal and then go to Ms. Garvey.
Sure. One about schools and one about Metro. With regard, Mr. Manager, you described how the proposed penny would be to pay for staff in new schools, as well as to be matched by 5.5 staff on the quote county side. Excuse me, are those 5.5 FTE on the counties, or I suppose not FTE, one of them is a PTE, if it's a 0.5. Are those staff also associated with the new schools opening their doors in September?
Yes, so with Arlington Public Schools, the kinds of costs that they're covering are for getting a new principal or new janitorial staff, and similarly, those 5.5 positions are new people that will go into those specifically, and I'm going to have the names of all the schools wrong because they've renamed them, but it's the Fleet School, the Stratford School, and then I think it's the
Ham.
Oh, okay, and the Ham School, I apologize. And then I think there's Wuthering Heights.
Excellent. So those SROs and nurses are affiliated
Yes.
with those 3 schools. And at risk of getting too granular, because I know we're going to have a pretty extensive conversations both in our joint work session with the school board and then probably again with DHS. But as we talk about those nurses, can you just say a word or two about the function? Because I know the issue of mental health counselors and support staff was a really key topic and likely will be again. So these are nurses that are physical health out of DHS, is that right?
They're the public health nurses, and so it's a combination of nurses and clinic aides. There's a whole sort of, if you will, formula depending on whether it's an elementary school, a middle, or a high school. You might recall that a few years ago now, we bumped up those staffing those staffing ratios, and this is consistent with that. But no, these are in the public health domain. I do know that DHSO is actively working, in particular with principals, to get in there as much as they can on the mental health side, completely understanding what you've just said.
Great. Okay, good. Look forward to more discussion to come. The other question I wanted to ask was, Mr. Manager, in the past couple of years, we spent a lot of time talking, and in fact, I believe when we agreed to a tax rate increase 2 years ago, it was with the understanding that a significant amount would be to Metro. That's been a huge driver of both our capital and operating budget. Can you talk a little bit about the assumptions here underlying the assumptions about how much you've added into your budget?
So there are 8 people sitting at this table, and I'm not the expert on Metro, but I will do my best. The expert is pouring some water into a cup. But the general manager has come forward with a proposed budget that has several pieces to it that include the cost increases that we had anticipated under the agreement that had been reached about funding for Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, which is that operating cost increases would be kept to a 3% increase. I've included that in my budget. I've also included some funding related to the arbitration awards that were made for employees and the wages. And also, when you get into the Metro section, there's some other payments we had to repay some balances that we had, I think, at NVTA. But beyond that, I have not provided any of the funding that the general manager is assuming in his budget for service enhancements and a few other issues. I think that my colleagues in Northern Virginia have taken varying approaches on this. They included a little bit more than 3%, thinking that some of those other costs may end up being realized. I think that it's an open question whether there's an incremental cost above what I've included in my budget that would need to be funded. And that, as I mentioned in my presentation, you might want to provide yourselves with a little flexibility on the tax rate in order to address that. But I think that actually will be known. That number will be known because the Metro budget will be adopted in March. So potentially.
And before I leave the topic and yield the floor, you said some funding for arbitration awards. Can you give us an order of magnitude, knowing that the full details won't be available online?
It's $2.8 million, and I think that it's essentially one-time funds. We paid a tranche for fiscal 19, and we have an amount for fiscal 20. And the way Metro, my understanding is the way they do their finances is that the future cost of that will end up being spread in future fiscal years. So there isn't an ongoing hit right now, but it will be showing up in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. First, I want to say I feel so much better than I thought I was going to feel a few months ago. This is just much better. And you told us a couple of days ago, I found about this increase in site plans that we're expecting, and I keep mulling it over. So I can see increasing our staff. That's great. There are these other people that handle site plans, like our Planning Commission and your county board. And a lot of what we do are site plans, and this is a tripling of the load. Have you thought about, I mean, I don't even necessarily think you have, I'm not even sure if they're exactly budget related. I mean, if I could do something with that $1 million, I'd buy us more time. I mean, you know, like 26 hours in a day or something, yeah. But we can't do that, and maybe there's some other ways to do it. But have you done any thinking about, and am I right to be concerned? It feels to me like that's gonna be it's like something, you know, big bump moving through.
You know, I've done some thinking about it, but our CPHD staff and DES and everybody's been doing a lot of thinking about that. And we have that problem, and I would have to go back and look historically. I think that would be an unprecedented level of effort on the part of everybody involved. And as you noted, we have one planning commission, one county board, and I think that we're going to have to be thinking long and hard about how we go through the review process. We have shown that as an organization and with the leadership of the board and what's happened over the last few years, that we're able to handle very complicated and complex plans through a fairly efficient site plan review process. We've changed some of the, I think the Planning Commission's done a very good job at sort of limiting the number of meetings they have. At a certain point, though, there will be a choke point. And so the questions come up, and a number of developers suggested, well, why don't you come up with an expedited process that we could deal with this on a separate track? And my response to that is, well, who gets to go on the special track? Who's going to make the decisions? Are we going to have like a little mini planning commission and another 5-member county board? I mean, there's only so much that you can do. So I think the answer really is going to rely on us being very thoughtful and diligent and getting some direction, both from you and also some commitment from the development community. So one thing we've done that actually I think will help a lot is we have engaged in what are called concept reviews early on in the planning process, spent a lot of time up front working with developers and moving some of those things, some of their plans along. And also the other work that the Planning Commission does on zoning ordinance changes, this board has been, I think, very helpful to us in saying some of those things can go through a little bit more on an not expedited basis, but we don't need to take as long as we have in doing some things, for example, we did with non-conforming uses and a few other issues. So the board has a fair amount of control, but I can't, after talking about that for 3 minutes, I can't talk away your main point.
No, thank you. And and I'm thinking we have a large planning commission. Some places are small. I could see even the planning commission, going 2 different groups, but it still comes down to this 5-member board, and it's going to be something for us to. I mean, I could see us going to Tuesday, Thursday meetings or something. Anyway, I think it's something we do really need to be thinking about, and I'm not sure how we're going to solve it. Thank you.
Thanks. While other colleagues are formulating any questions that they may have, I will just address Ms. Crystal and Metro. One of the benefits of my serving as chair of the Metro Finance Committee, I do have a little bit of window on what's going to be happening there, and I do expect, without predicting an outcome, that any additional there will be some additional monies that I do believe that we will find that Arlington should be required to pay into as part of the Metro budget. As an order of magnitude, I do not believe that those will be substantial enough to require a discrete increment of a penny of the tax rate. I do think we're going to be talking about something that's within the realm of $1 million or less total, which I think we can figure out how to manage over the course of the budget season.
So, Mr. Chair, just one question. Sorry, I've got the one.
That's the one I used to have. I'm sorry. I should have
worries
about that, Matt.
No worries at all. So just on the legislative, on the assumptions that you made with respect to the legislative side, is there some uncertainty and talk about whether flexibility is, you think is advisable there, and how conservative you've been on those assumptions?
So the main item that we've been tracking is related to Medicaid expansion, and I'm going to ask Michelle to walk through what the current status is in the legislature, and my proposal is essentially to meet those obligations through a combination of ongoing one-time money, but Michelle will give you the details.
Sure. So I think you recall that, I mean, first of all, we're all thrilled that Medicaid expansion is happening in Virginia. We had projected that that we would have, around 2,900 Arlingtonians become eligible for Medicaid, and right now, at the end of December, give or take, we were at 2,400. So that's really fantastic. The way in the throes of the end of last year's session, the way the General Assembly was funded on Medicaid expansion was they funded a portion of Medicaid via reductions to CSBs across the Commonwealth. And that was based on assumptions that those CSBs would be able to submit to Medicaid for reimbursement for services to behaviorally and developmentally disabled folks. And that impact then for Arlington was around $1.7 million. And our folks, after reviewing everything, are not convinced that we can recover that much from Medicaid for a whole series of reasons. So I think the Commonwealth, across the Commonwealth, all the various CSBs and the association with CFBs, I'm working to, hopefully in the short General Assembly session, get some fixes. The governor did propose $7 million in his budget amendments. $7 million, if we're at 1.7, that solves Fairfax maybe, not everyone. So, but it was a first step. I think that's carried through. I think everything is with the Senate now, and that will help. But it is nowhere near the appropriate solution for this $1.7 million gap that we have. The way the manager's budget has proposed as an interim step or a bridge, at least to get us through 2020, is that it's been half funded with one time and half funded with ongoing in our budget, with the hope that possibly when we get to next year's session, that we can find a more fulsome and complete solution that doesn't require full funding from the county, if you will. And we will have more time over the next 6 months to really see how the Medicaid reimbursement process works for us, for better or for worse, right? It's a whole new world in that area. I mean, we're used to Medicaid reimbursement, but this bigger thing with the behavioral health and developmentally disabled. Does that?
Sure, that's great. And so it's not, other than the Medicaid, there's not a huge amount of variability that you would think.
No, there isn't. I mean, there's always a bit of a wild card when it comes to transportation funding, because I think that until the General Assembly wraps up its budget work, sometimes there's a miracle that happens. I'm not counting on it, but there was a commitment on the part of the governor to try to address some of the challenges that were created by the way the Metro funding was put together. I haven't seen anything public or out loud being talked about that gives me any sense of confidence, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed, but we haven't relied on that in formulating the budget.
Great, thanks.
Mr. Gutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have sort of the question that Mr. DeFerranti just asked about the state. I wanted to ask about the federal government. So we have had conversations in the past about the impact, which I think we have not really necessarily fully realized or analyzed or understood yet, the impact on our budget, both on the revenue side in terms of what doesn't directly impact our revenue, but in terms of the pinch, if you will, that the average household might feel in terms of their tax bills related to the federal tax changes in federal tax policy. So that's one part of the question. And then the other part of that, though, is then also on our expenditure side, changes in funding formulas and the way that dollars flow down from the federal government, sometimes through the state, but to us. In particular, I think of this being more sensitive in the areas of the way that we fund our health and human services and some infrastructure and other things. So if you just talk generally about what we know about anticipated impacts on the budget seen that relate both on the revenue and the expenditure side.
Right. So on the revenue side, I think that well, actually, you didn't quite ask this particular point, but I did want to address sort of what happened with the impact of the shutdown, the 35 days. We're seeing, and as the information comes in we get reports filed February, March. We took a hit like we did the last time there was a shutdown on our transit occupancy tax and some of our other more discretionary kinds of taxes that are based on tourists and people coming to this area to do business. So that is something that that's what we have. We have an economic contingent fund in case we're somehow short in fiscal 19. That's where we would typically go to make that up. As far as the larger question about tax reform on the federal level and what happened with the state, the budget agreement that talked about, again, there was some hope that maybe some of that money would come back to the localities, has been, I think the deal is essentially to increase the standard deductions and make some changes that may flow to individual taxpayers. I have not seen, and maybe it has been done, what would a typical Virginia taxpayer or even a typical Arlington taxpayer, the impact compounded of the federal and the state changes. And so we'll be trying to do some analysis on that. So I don't have an answer for you on that. And then on the formula side with health and human service programs, the adoption of the funding package in the federal government, as far as I'm aware, has not negatively affected, and actually some of the funding there actually I think has gone up a little bit, but nothing that we really are counting on that much.
Yeah, and I think when we do the revenue overview, we can get more into that. We only get, maybe like a little over 1% of the entire general fund budget for the county comes from direct federal, grants. It's largely in human services, and we get some in the emergency preparedness area. And then the other big program, of course, is housing choice vouchers, also known as Section 8. We had been concerned with the shutdown that there were just going to be cash flow issues, that they were going to shut down the program, and we were digging into administrative reserve, and we would have to dig into administrative reserves. But that's all been resolved. Now, to your point, though, that a fair amount of DHS funding does pass through the state via formula. So I think we can sort of lay out where we think there are risks. But so far, knock on laminate, we're good, but I say that knowing, here we go, we're going to start another budget cycle with the federal government, and so I think we can give you a good education on the risks that we're worried about there. That's good. Helpful.
All right, so just a couple of points, not necessarily questions. Schools, just virtue of everyone, we don't have a full picture yet because the school system is at a different place in their budget process, so we don't know exactly what their ask is of us, but from the manager's perspective, just to reiterate, so you have fully adhered to the direction last fall to account for all of the openings of new facilities, as well as the principles of revenue sharing, which account for enrollment growth. What we don't know is what the school system will present to us is additional desires above and beyond those baselines, but those are accounted for within the $0.015 that you have increased the tax rate in this budget?
That is correct.
Okay. And just for the purposes of people who may be viewing the chart on page 12 in isolation, I guess I would encourage everyone to not look at it in isolation and to also make sure they're viewing it with the bulleted points on slide 11, just so that those figures at the bottom are put into context. Those figures in terms of the year-over-year changes are inclusive of the growth of nearly 3% in residential real estate taxes, in addition to the implications of those particular fee increases. A penny on the tax rate is somewhere between $65 and $68 in and of itself.
Right. So essentially, by my proposing $0.015, that comes to, that by itself is about $100 that's added on to what had already been about $177 worth of tax bill increase that people were going to get if we had done nothing.
Sure. Thank you.
That's really helpful. I think maybe at some point we could change the title, because I hadn't picked that up. I was sort of muddling it, seemed kind of high. So that would be really helpful to somehow maybe get on the slide or something, because people will take it. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions, I'll ask the manager, do you have any final points? Mr. Stevenson, Ms. Cowan, any of you would like to make?
Well, I would, just the observation that I think I made in talking to you, which is that this budget has proven to be one of the stranger ones I've ever worked on, because it started from a place of abject despair and went to a place where I know that I'm reminded often by maybe it's a bad analogy, but going into a department store, you have lots of choices here. And I know you don't have to thank me right now. You can wait till the end of the process for giving you a number of decisions to have to tick through and choices to make, unlike the fiscal 19 budget where I said, here's a budget. If you want to add something, you've got to cut something else. You have various opportunities here to craft and improve upon what I've proposed.
And we look forward to doing so, Mr. Manager. We look forward to doing so, and I guess with this, we get to the point where on Saturday, we'll have the official handover of the budget from the manager to us, and a short 48 hours before we can all digest where we want to advertise the real estate tax rate. So with that, unless there are any further comments or questions, we'll adjourn this work session and look forward to 2 months of budget fun. We're out.